What do people need to know about how the IRS delivers correspondence to taxpayers?
Don't expect a text. The IRS doesn't initiate contact with taxpayers by email to request any kind of personal or financial information. Generally, they would first mail a paper bill to a person who owes taxes. So those are the paper letters and notices that taxpayers should be on the lookout for in January.
Oh, so if you get a phone call from somebody saying they're from the IRS, they probably are not.
That's right.
Is there an expiration date for the penalty relief?
The expiration date is April 1st, but remember, the sooner you pay, the lower the tax bill will be because interest keeps accruing. But after April 1st, those late payment penalties will get posted back to your account.
So if somebody feels that they'll be affected by this, what's the first step for them to do?
Luckily, this is all going to be automatic penalty relief. So starting this week, the IRS is going in and adjusting taxpayers' accounts to take off the late payment penalties for those 2 years. But it's a wake-up call, a call to action to look at your tax debt and understand that the interest is still accruing and you try to get a handle on it. I mean, obviously they make it easy to pay, but even if you can't pay or facing a hardship, there are things that you can do. Set up partial payment plans or even try to secure an offer in compromise where you settle your tax debts for less than what you owe.
That's Wall Street Journal personal finance reporter Ashley Ebling. And that's it for your money briefing. We're off Monday for the Christmas holiday, but we'll be back Tuesday with a special series on the economic factors that impacted our finances and careers in 2023 and what to expect in 2024. This episode was produced by Ariana Osperu. I'm your host, J.R. Whalen. Our supervising producer is Melanie Roy. Aisha Al-Muslim is our development producer. Scott Salloway and Chris Zinsley are our deputy editors. And Philana Patterson is the Wall Street Journal's head of news audio. Thanks for listening.
Hi, I'm Julia Carpenter.
And I'm Beret Lamb. We're both journalists on the Wall Street Journal's personal finance team.
So much of the money advice out there feels condescendingly basic or galaxy brain level advanced.
That's why we created a financial workbook that everyone can use. The New Rules of Money is out now, available where books are sold.
Support for this episode comes from Zelle. You'd never fall for an online scam, right? You use two-factor authentication, ignore calls from everyone named Spam Risk, and never use the password. But scammers are getting more sophisticated and more active, which means they're finding millions of new victims every single year. The good news is that there's a lot you can do to protect yourself on the wild, wild web. For starters, Zelle wants to remind you, only send money to people you know and trust. Zelle is available to United States bank account holders only. Terms and conditions apply.
Support for Criminal comes from Alfa Romeo. The all-new Alfa Romeo Tonale is the result of years of refinement.
Christmas horror comedy film, plus actor Timothée Chalamet on Wonka. That's all in the Arts Hour from the BBC.
Friday and Saturday nights at 10 on 91.7 WVXU.
This week on This American Life, one way to understand this year in politics is to look at the Republican Party in Michigan. In last year's elections, they suffered historic losses, and then they elected somebody as their state party chair who wanted to push the exact same ideas that voters rejected. How it's worked for them, it's been a crazy, tumultuous, fascinating, epic story.
Come on, Ken, look at all the files, baby. Come on, baby, come on.
It was this week.
Saturday afternoons at 1 and Sunday nights at 10 on WVXU and WMUV.
I was born and raised in Southwest Ohio, and I'm still fascinated by the people and stories I run across working for 91.7 WVXU. I'm Dick Swartzell, and whether I'm covering housing or transportation, I know it's all important to our community. My stories are always available on our website, wvxu.org.
Coming up as the program continues at 7:08, UN Security Council proposals to call for a Gaza ceasefire or put the UN in charge of aid inspections were weakened to try to win support from the U.S., which backs Israel's fight against Hamas. Michelle Kellerman will report. From 9 First Morning weather, mostly cloudy with isolated showers late today and a high of 53. Taking a quick look at traffic, no incidents being reported at this time.
Local support for Marketplace comes from Sharonville Convention Center, focused on creating exceptional event experiences. New for 2023 will be the Todd Portune Exhibit Hall with a capacity of up to 2,000 for dinner and 40,000 square feet of exhibit space. The Sharonville Convention Center is dedicated to making your events even better. More information at SharonvilleConventionCenter.com.
Why Cuba has lost 4% of its population in the last 2 years.
Marketplace Morning Report is supported by UKG, an HR payroll and workforce management solution designed to help make a fairy tale workplace a reality. UKG, our purpose is people.
From Marketplace, I'm Sabri Benishore, in for David Brancaccio. Cuba in a moment. First, let's talk homes. A lot of people are kind of stuck in their homes. They have low mortgage rates from years gone by, and they don't want to give those rates up for a new house with a new high mortgage rate. That means a lot of the supply on the market is coming from newly built homes. We're going to find out how those new home sales are doing later this morning from the Commerce Department. The expectation is that they will have increased as mortgage rates have come down by a percentage point in the last couple months. Marketplace's Nova Safo has more.
The average interest rate on a 30-year home loan is now at 6.8%, the lowest since June. Mortgage rates are tied to the benchmark 10-year Treasury yield, which itself responds to changes in the Federal Reserve's overnight funds rate. Fed officials have been raising that interest rate, now holding it steady, and expected to start reducing it sometime next year. In anticipation, the 10-year Treasury yield has been falling too, and with it, mortgage rates. They hit a high in late October. The average rate on a 30-year home loan was at almost 8%. It has since been falling. That's been good news for the housing market. Existing home sales in November rose after 5 straight months of declines. I'm Nova Safo for Marketplace.
China is taking on its online gaming industry with new restrictions aimed at limiting in-game purchases and compulsive playing behavior. The announcement wiped nearly $80 billion in market value from China's 2 biggest gaming companies, Tencent and NetEase. Here's the BBC's Monica Miller in Singapore.
This is basically Beijing officials trying to rein in what they see as a growing trend of gaming addiction, particularly among young people. So what these new rules require are online games to set spending limits, also in-game measures that would incentivize high spending. For example, giving them money basically for every time they log in. All of that's going to be banned. Plus, a lot of the software is going to require pop-ups that warn of irrational playing behavior depending on how long you've been on one of these games. But this is a massive blow to the world's biggest games market, which really just returned to growth not too long ago.
BBC's Monica Miller in Singapore. Tencent, by the way, is the world's biggest gaming company. Its shares tumbled by as much as 16% at one point after the announcement. Shares of NetEase plunged 25%. Let's do the numbers. Dow, S&P, and NASDAQ futures are down the 1 to 0.3% range, with Dow futures down 113 points. The yield on the 10-year Treasury is 3.864%.
Marketplace Morning Report is supported by Schwab. Schwab knows that investors want control of their financial future. That's why when it comes to wealth management, Schwab is dedicated to giving investors more choices. More at schwab.com.
Cubans are fleeing their country in droves. Around 400,000 Cubans came to the U.S. over the last 2 years. This wave has a lot to do with the deteriorating economic situation on the island. Guillermo Grenier is here to help us understand what's happening. He's a professor of sociology at Florida International University. Welcome.
Great to be here.
So Cuba has lost 4% of its population in 2 years as people leave. You just got back from a trip there. What is happening there that is driving so many people to leave?
It's primarily an economy that just cannot get back to pre-2020 levels. And what's worse is there's no plan in sight. People are every day having a very rough time finding just the basics. Things are bad, but there seems to be a new sense of hopelessness.
In so many places, there was a big comeback, economically speaking, after the pandemic. Why did that not happen in Cuba?
It's a multitude of reasons. Since the 1990s, we've had 2 currencies where you have one for tourists, in essence, and the one that Cubans live their national economic lives with, the peso cubano. Economists from all over the world have been telling them, you have to unite this currency. This is ridiculous. Well, they did it, but they did it in the middle of a pandemic. So inflation just went rampant. And then you had the fact that the economy had doubled down on tourism. And then all of a sudden, pandemic was there, and they had one-trick pony economy, and it didn't snap back. Since they doubled down on tourism, all other sectors of the economy suffered. I mean, Cuba's importing just about every food product that finally makes it into the street, if it does.
To return for a moment to this exodus of people, how is the Cuban government responding to that?
So now they're thinking of immigration. Number one is a problem, which is kind of new in the sense that before there was always some justification, either blaming the U.S. policies of how we receive Cubans, but now they see it as a problem. And then now they're saying, how can we maintain in touch with these folks that are leaving? It's not unusual to have expats that live in other countries. For Cuba it is, but in general in the world that's a phenomenon that's been long understood. Now they want to establish that link between the expat community, the diaspora community, and the country. The gut instinct is correct. I'm doing interviews of new arrivals here, and it's clear that their motivation to leave is dominantly economics. Economics in Cuba is not that separate from the government, given it's a centralized economy, so they blame the government for them having to leave, but it's because of economic reasons. And they're immediately thinking of how to do business back in Cuba. The bright side of this huge immigration is that in the long run, it might actually benefit the Cuban economic development.
Cuba is not what you might call a market-embracing or market-oriented economy. Is the government there equipped with the tools necessary to kind of get out of this?
Well, the short answer is probably no. Right now, there is a sense that the folks that want more opening up at the economy, particularly, have a leg up because the situation is so dire that folks are beginning to think somewhat outside the box. And creating these small business enterprises, the MIPYMES, that is a big step forward, and they are growing. There is a class structure being developed, not as quickly as during the Obama years, but even now you do have these private sector enterprises that are beginning to grow.
Guillermo Grenier is professor of sociology in the Department of Global and Sociocultural Studies at Florida International University. Professor Grenier, thank you so much.
Thank you for having me.
We've got a lot more from that interview on our website and podcast. In New York, I'm Sabri Ben-Achour with the Marketplace Morning Report. From 8 p.m., American Public Media.
It's a minute before 7 o'clock. There's a wreck that has the left 2 lanes blocked northbound 75 at the Butler Regional Highway.
Support comes from Cincinnati Children's, focused on advancing discovery, improving lives, and changing outcomes since 1883. As a nonprofit hospital and research center, donations of every size provide health and hope. Gifts made before December 31st will go further thanks to Hyundai Hope on Wheels. Learn more at cincinnatichildrens.org/match.
Support comes from the University of Cincinnati College of Medicine and UC Physicians, where award-winning faculty with expertise in all aspects of medical education strive to ensure that the next generation of physicians are well prepared on day one and every day after. Learn more at med.uc.edu/indispensable.
Mostly cloudy today with some isolated showers late.
91.7 WVXU Cincinnati and 88.5 WMUP Oxford. News from Cincinnati Public Radio and NPR.
Good morning. More than 20,000 Palestinians, roughly 1% of Gaza's population, have died in the ongoing Israeli offensive. There are calls for a ceasefire at the United Nations, even a temporary one. So what's the holdup? It's Morning Edition from NPR News. Plus, we speak with writer Masha Gessen, who compares Gaza to a Jewish ghetto in Nazi-occupied Europe. I'm Martinez.
And I'm Leila Fadel. Gessen warns that the world needs to step in to fulfill the promise of never again. And there's a new big-screen version of The Color Purple. Director Blitz Bazawule and actor Danielle Brooks speak with our co-host Michelle Martin about the new adaptation. It's Friday, December 22nd. Happy birthday to All About That bass singer, Meghan Trainor. She turns 30 today. The news is next.
Live from NPR News in Washington, I'm Corva Coleman. Israel's military says it is reviewing allegations that its soldiers summarily killed 11 Palestinians in northern Gaza. The UN's Office on Human Rights has called on Israel to immediately investigate. If proven, it says the deaths could be classified as a war crime. NPR's Carrie Kahn reports.
In response to an inquiry by NPR, Israel's military said the details of the event that reportedly took place in the Al Ramal neighborhood of Gaza City in front of family members on December 19th were not familiar to them. In a text message, the military said a review is now underway and stressed its troops, quote, take precautions to reduce harm to those not involved in hostilities. Israel's military has told civilians to move from northern Gaza, forcing 85% of the population to leave their homes. Friday, Gaza's health ministry said more than 20,000 people have been killed since Israel launched its offensive, following Hamas's attack on southern Israel that killed more than 1,200 people. Carrie Kahn, NPR News, Tel Aviv.
Former Trump attorney Rudy Giuliani is declaring bankruptcy. That comes a week after a federal jury ordered that he pay $148 million in damages for defaming 2 Georgia election workers. From member station WABE in Atlanta, Sam Greenglass has more.
This week, a federal judge ordered Giuliani to immediately pay the former election workers, Shay Moss and Ruby Freeman, saying Giuliani proved an uncooperative litigant and may move to conceal his assets. Bankruptcy would not likely erase the damages Giuliani owes. He reported between $1 and $10 million in assets and $153 million in debts, including tax liabilities and legal fees. Following the 2020 election, Giuliani falsely accused Moss and Freeman of election fraud, exposing them to a torrent of threats. They're now suing again to stop him from continuing to tell lies about them. For NPR News, I'm Sam Greenglass in Atlanta.
A Washington state jury has acquitted 3 Tacoma police officers of murder and manslaughter in the 2020 killing of Manny Ellis, a black man. The officers said Ellis attacked them. Video showed Ellis hogtied, tasered, and at one point in a chokehold. He warned the officers he could not breathe. Tacoma Mayor Victoria Woodards expressed outrage after the verdict.
I want to acknowledge the anger, the distrust, the doubt, the fear, the hurt, and the exhaustion that we as black people have experienced as a result of the history of policing in this country.
The local medical examiner in Washington state had ruled Ellis's death was a homicide. You're listening to NPR News.
Support for NPR comes from NPR stations. Other contributors include the Alfred P. Sloan Foundation, supporting books, radio, podcasts, film, television, theater, and more to bridge science and the humanities. And the listeners who support this NPR station.
Good morning. It's 7:04 and 37 degrees in Cincinnati, 39 in Dayton. This is 91.7 WVXU. I'm Tana Weingartner in for Marianne Zalesnik. An open U.S. House seat for one of the most heavily Republican districts in Ohio has drawn a double-digit crowd of GOP candidates for the March 7th primary election. A dozen Republican candidates filed petitions in southern Ohio's 15-county 2nd Congressional District by the Wednesday deadline. 2 Democrats have also filed. The seat is open because U.S. Representative Brad Winstrip, the Iraq War veteran and foot doctor, decided not to run again. The district spans 15 southern Ohio counties. You can read more at WVXU.org. A candlelight vigil in Washington Park last night honored Cincinnatians who died because of homelessness over the last year. Josh Spring of the Greater Cincinnati Homeless Coalition said 91.7 WVXU. If you're in the holiday spirit, our sister station, 90.9 WGUC, is the place to be. Their Classic Christmas is underway with a beautiful mix of holiday music. You can listen on air or on the website at WGUC.org.
We value the trust you put in us to bring you the best tri-state news coverage, and now you can start each weekday informed about our community. Subscribe to our Daily View email and receive stories from the award-winning WVXU news team in time for your morning coffee. Visit WVXU.org to subscribe.
I'm Maria Hinojosa. This week on Latino USA. When domestic violence unfolds in a home, how do you protect the children? We investigate the case of Leah Garcia and what happened to her son, Joseph, when he was placed in the LA County foster care system.
My head's just going out of control. Where's my son at? Why hasn't anybody called me? How come nobody contacted me?
That's this week on Latino USA.
Saturday evenings at 6 and Monday nights at 11 on 91.7 WVXU.
WVXU goes wherever you do. Listen to 91.7 online at iHeartRadio.com and on your mobile device through the iHeartRadio app.
This is Fresh Air. Earlier this month, The Zone of Interest was named the Best Picture of 2023 by the Los Angeles Film Critics Association. Our critic Justin Chang, who's a member of that organization, says the movie is a chillingly restrained drama about the real-life Nazi who oversaw the Auschwitz concentration camp. It's the latest from Jonathan Glazer, English director of the movies Sexy Beast and Under the Skin. Here's Justin's review.
The Zone of Interest begins on a lovely afternoon somewhere in the Polish countryside. A husband and wife are enjoying a picnic on the banks of a river with their 5 children. They eat lunch and then splash around in the sunshine. It all looks so peaceful, so inviting. But something seems strangely amiss once the family returns home. They live in a beautiful villa with an enormous garden, a greenhouse, and a small swimming pool. But before long, odd details intrude into the frame, like the long concrete wall edged with barbed wire, and the ominous-looking buildings behind it. And almost every scene is underscored by a low, unceasing metallic drone, which sometimes mixes with the sounds of human screams, dog barks, and gunshots. It's 1943, and this family lives next door to Auschwitz. The husband, played by a chillingly calm Christian Friedel, is the camp commandant Rudolf Hess, who's remembered now as the man who made Auschwitz the single most efficient killing machine during the Holocaust. But the director Jonathan Glazer never brings us inside the camp or depicts any of the atrocities we're used to seeing in movies about the subject. Instead, he grounds his story in the quotidian rhythms of the Hess's life, observing them over several months as they go about their routine, while a massive machinery of death grinds away next door. In the mornings, Rudolf rides a horse from his yard up to the gates of Auschwitz, the world's shortest, ghastliest commute. His wife, Hedwig, played by Sandra Hüller from Anatomy of a Fall, might sit
Spotlight on WMKV and WLHS, and my voice pales next to his. Dan Sweeney is here in the studio with us. One Hit Wonders. You can hear his program 3 o'clock on Sundays. That was I've Come of Age by Billy Storm, 1959, hit number 28. I got to do Dan sing for just a moment there. Dan Sweeney here with us, and Dan, I know we're going to do some more of these segments to talk more about some local and Southwest Ohio One Hit Wonders, but just a fun, really an excursion today into some music. What can you tell people to look forward to? Say they've not heard the show that airs here on WMKV 3 o'clock on Sundays. What people expect?
What do they expect when they tune in, right? Okay, then for
Spring.
Need of a good read or just want to keep up with the books everyone's talking about? NPR's Book of the Day podcast gives you today's very best writing in a pocket-sized show. Whether you're looking to engage with the big questions of our times or temporarily escape from them, we've got an author who'll speak to you. Catch today's great books in 15 minutes or less on the Book of the Day podcast, only from NPR.
Hey there, it's the NPR Politics Podcast. I'm Tamara Keith, I cover the White House.
I'm Susan Davis, I cover politics.
And I'm Domenico Montanaro, senior political editor and correspondent. President Biden's re-election bid has a generational problem, and it might not be the one you're thinking of. While Gen Z is lukewarm on giving Biden another term, Gen X may, in fact, be the most hostile toward the president.
Are we allowed to talk about Gen X? We never talk about
This
Gen
might
X.
be the first pod.
Yeah.
The forgotten generation, Gen X. Well, okay, so let's just skip ahead to the full disclosure part. I think technically speaking, all three of us in this podcast are members of Generation X. Though I don't think any of us really claim it because we're all on the cusp.
We're Xennials, as we've talked about in the polls previously, in the pod previously.
We are either very old millennials or very young Gen Xers.
Yeah, very young Gen X.
And while I want to be very young...
Okay. I want my MTV.
Yeah, well, truly, and I wanted to have music videos.
Correct.
So let's get to the story here. Our latest polling data shows Gen Xers have the highest disapproval rating for President Biden. So today we are going to talk about what's driving that anger or angst, to use a very Gen X term, and explore how this happened and whether there is a way back for Biden. So Sue, define Gen X for us demographically.
For the purpose of this political conversation, obviously there's a little bit of quibble around when generations start and end, but we're talking about people who were born between the years of 1965 and 1980, roughly. People that grew up in the Carter and Reagan era of politics, essentially 90s kids. Thanks for calling us out.
Early mid-40s, as I like to say.
Youthful 40s.
So how much of the electorate are they?
Well, it's interesting because I've done a lot of reporting on this, and Generation X, politically speaking, isn't as influential as the other generations. By population, they're smaller than both the boomers and millennials, and they also haven't tended to have as high a level of political engagement compared to other generations. It might be, you could say that it sort of rings true that they've also been dubbed the slacker generation. There is also maybe a slightly higher level of disinterest or disgust with politics. I mean, if you've seen a Kevin Smith movie, you know why.
I may have seen all of them.
Yeah, me too.
So why is this generation tilting conservative?
So one of the people I interviewed for this story is Dr. Jean Twenge. Her whole field of study is basically generational differences. And one of the things she told me is that your political attitudes can start to be shaped as young as childhood. So part of the reason why Gen X tends to tilt more Republican is basically just when they were born.
Gen X is the most Republican of the generations. And that fits some other data analyses suggesting that political leanings of generations are often influenced by the popularity of the president when that generation is in adolescence or young adulthood. And for Gen X, that was Ronald Reagan. He was a very popular Republican president.
And I would say that this rang true. Shout out to Jung Yoon, who works on our desk. She helped me do some voter callbacks to talk to Gen X voters. And this was something that they all acknowledged, that there was sort of this nostalgia for their youth. And one of the people we talked to is a guy named Ken Piccolo. He is a teacher, a substitute teacher. He lives in California. He, right now, actually intends to vote for Biden. He says he approves of him. But he did speak of this nostalgia.
Ronald Reagan made me feel good about being a U.S. citizen, being American. He made you feel like it was worthwhile and we're a good country and we're doing some good stuff.
You might say that a lot of Gen X wants to make America great again.
Well, let's talk about the numbers here, because we are saying that Gen X is down on Biden. What does that actually look like? What does our latest polling say?
Well, Sue and I were talking about this because we saw it in November's poll, and then it showed up again in December's poll, and we said, yeah, I think there's something there. And it turns out that 62% said that they disapprove of the job that President Biden is doing. 62%. It's a huge number, much higher than the other generations. 52% of them strongly disapprove of the job Biden is doing. And, that's really notable because if you think about how a lot of what we saw in our favorability ratings comparing Trump and Biden, for example, Trump is generally a little bit more disliked than Biden overall, but not with Gen X.
I also think the strong disapprove number is really interesting to me because the reason why we break that down, like strong approves, likely disapprove, is it really speaks to intensity of disapproval. So like Gen X says, more than half of Gen Xers say they strongly disapprove of Biden. Compare that to 35% of Gen Z and millennials. It's just a much more potent disapproval among generations, even though basically all generations have levels of disapproval of Joe Biden right now, but it is just most acute and most potent among Gen X.
So who says they're indifferent? But my question also is, okay, so they don't like Joe Biden. Do they like Donald Trump?
Not in particular. I mean, they have a 53% unfavorable rating for Trump. They have a 60% unfavorable rating of Biden. So maybe we are going back to the idea that they are indifferent and don't like either person and might not entirely vote. But this is a generation that is raising kids, spending money, is still in that target demographic for advertisers. So there's a lot of things for them to be concerned about, worried about, and clearly their politics, they're not thrilled with what the direction of where things are going.
In your reporting, what did you find is driving their discontent?
Look, part of this is obviously just the time of life that they're in. Right now, in the 2024 election cycle, Gen Xers happen to be those middle-aged Americans. And at that, I know, it's hard to hear those words, I realize. But it's also the time in basically anyone's life in which you're feeling the greatest financial crunch. And one of the people I talked to is Amy Walter, friend of the pod, herself a Gen Xer. She's a nonpartisan political analyst, and she said this really resonated with her.
You're feeling every squeeze of modern society at this age in your life, which most people in their 40s and 50s do feel. I just think uniquely situated in a very uncomfortable place right now.
A lot of Gen Xers are sandwiched between aging parents and the care and cost associated with that. They have young children in the home, or they're looking at paying for college, they're worried about retirement, and all the rising costs associated with inflation are hitting them acutely hard right now.
It's hard to concentrate. I feel like I'm in a Gen X therapy session now.
It's a little bit like group I was just going to say, I literally had to get off the phone with my parents and their doctor to come here to tape this podcast. So
Sandwich generation, undoubtedly. My dad can't figure out how to plug in a printer anymore.
Yeah. I will also say this, and this is anecdotal, but we've talked so much about President Biden's age and how it's a factor for people. I think you could argue that's an element that's acutely true for Gen X because he's the same age as a lot of our parents. And a lot of us are looking at our parents and thinking, oof, they're not the same as they used to be 5, 10, 15 years ago. And that's a reality you're dealing with in your own life that might also project into how you're viewing the presidential candidates right now.
All right, well, we're going to take a quick break. And when we get back, more about Gen X and the culture wars.
Hey, it's Asma Khalid. As the year wraps up and we're reflecting on a huge year of political news with an even bigger year coming up in 2024 with a general election, we will continue working to help you keep up with all the political news happening in Washington, D.C. and around the country. And we hope we can count on your help. This is where we want to say a big thank you to our NPR Politics Plus supporters and anyone listening who already donates to public media. Your support ensures that everyone has free access to reliable news and podcasts, including those who can't afford to give this holiday season. And to anyone out there who is not a supporter yet, right now is the time to get behind the NPR network, especially ahead of a big election year. Supporting public media now takes just a few minutes and makes a real difference. So join NPR Plus at plus.npr.org or make a tax-deductible donation now at donate.npr.org/politics. And thanks.
Hey there, it's Aaron Scott from Shortwave, NPR's daily science podcast. I'm one of thousands of NPR network voices coming to you from over 200 local newsrooms across the country. We bring all Americans closer together through free and independent journalism, music, politics, culture, science, and so much more. The NPR Network. What you hear changes everything. Learn more at npr.org/network.
The news can feel incredibly overwhelming. For a breath of much-needed fresh air, head to npr.org's culture section. From the buzzy movies, Tiny Desk, and artists that everyone seems to know about, type in npr.org for the latest and greatest in the pop culture universe.
Listening to the news can feel like a journey. The 1A podcast is here to guide you beyond the headlines and cut through the noise. Listen to 1A, where we celebrate your freedom to listen by getting to the heart of the story together. Only from NPR.
And we're back. And Sue, Generation X was also raised in this 1990s era of, quote, political correctness, which was the term that everybody used back then, which is similar to how conservatives use the word woke in today's politics. Where do you think that fits into the approach that Gen X is taking to politics?
This was something that all of the sort of political experts I talked to agreed was a huge issue in how Gen X views the current political debate. Specifically that there is a big cultural divide between Gen X and Gen Z and millennials when it comes to issues of political speech. Sean Trendy is an analyst with Real Clear Politics, and he is also another Gen Xer, and he thought this was a huge reason that Gen X was really dissatisfied with the moment right now.
I think Generation X is the one that really reverberates negatively with the most, just because we grew up in this kind of era of just not trusting authority figures as a general matter, and almost kind of like a cultural libertarianism.
And what he means by that is there is this, right now we've been, for the past several years, we've been living in this debate about political speech and what's appropriate and what's not appropriate. And Gen Xers they're not conservative. They're not socially conservative. They're just not as progressive as young people. And they look at a lot of the debate over, let me give you two good examples that I think our podcast listeners, it'll make sense. These were examples that were given to me by Twangy. And the first one she talked about was, do you remember when Tom Cotton wrote the New York Times op-ed?
Right. Said that U.S. troops should be used to put down protesters.
Yes, and it caused a huge debate inside the New York Times. And the editor who allowed it to run was a Gen Xer, and there was an uprising, a revolt, essentially, at the newspaper, largely led by Gen Z and millennials who were saying this is dangerous speech, we shouldn't give it a platform. And the editor ultimately left the paper. The other example she gave me was Dave Chappelle. He's a comedian that a lot of Gen Xers think is really funny. He says a lot of really provocative things, but there's this attitude of Gen X, like, look, people should be able to say what they want to say, especially when it comes to speech or humor or comedians. But there was also a revolt at Netflix. They didn't want to carry his comedy anymore because of statements they thought were anti-trans, and a lot of that revolt was led by millennials and Gen Zers. So there's just a really a pointed cultural divide over what protected speech is and should be.
Just to look at a little bit of a conflict in how Gen X views some of these cultural issues. You know, in the December survey, the December NPR PBS NewsHour Marist poll, we asked about gender identity and whether or not people think that gender identity is based on the sex that's assigned at birth, or if it's not necessarily that. 62% of Gen Xers said that it is based on the sex assigned at birth. Now, at the same time, we asked about abortion rights, and only 38% of Gen Xers said that abortion should be banned at 6 weeks or later. So, you know, a little bit of a conflict there when it comes to where they really come down on some of these social issues.
Well, so, not to be harsh here, but if Gen X is this smaller piece of the electorate, maybe not the most significant voting bloc, does not vote in as great of strength as other generations, how much do they really matter in this presidential race?
And look, like we joked at the top of the podcast that this is probably the first conversation we've ever even had about Gen X voters. They are sort of the forgotten generation in politics. You don't have campaigns that are gearing messages towards Gen X or turnout or anything like that. Part of it is your political attitudes are probably pretty well formed at this point in your life. But I do think they matter in a certain respect. Whether Trump or Biden wins this election is reliant upon winning over some combination of people who do disapprove of them. They're going to have to win over some haters, you might say. The other thing we've talked about that I think is salient here too is third-party voters. One of the guys I talked to is a guy named Danny Dotson from Texas, and he was kind of evocative to me of this sort of stereotype of the Gen Xer. He basically said he never even really started paying attention to politics till he was in adulthood. He voted sporadically, doesn't really vote in midterms, and he started paying attention in the Trump years, but not to the extent you would think. He said he didn't vote in 2016. He voted third party in 2020, and he told me the only thing he knows for sure in 2024 is that he's not going to vote for either Trump or Biden, but he might vote third party. And third party voters could be a spoiler dynamic in this presidential race that can't be discounted.
They could. At the same time, there is the possibility that, you know, this conflict that we're seeing with culture, with some of the way that they feel about some of these cultural issues, you know, if you have a Republican candidate, for example, who is, you know, speaking in a very hardline way about abortion rights, it's been something that Democrats have been able to appeal. Voters on, you know, at the same time, if you have somebody on the other side speaking in a little bit more of an extreme way that they disagree with, who knows where they'll go. But yeah, I think third party is a huge potential problem, and for kind of either Trump or Biden, because you know that sort of takes out what you think is your pool of voters, and could throw an election in any other way, you know, or maybe they're just whipping out the flannels and saying, "I'm gonna stay home."
All right, we're going to leave it there for today or whatever. Brief note, you'll notice today is Friday, but we do not have a Can't Let It Go. But have no fear, next Friday we will bring you our annual Can't Let It Go Spectacular. The things from the entire year that we cannot let go of, politics or otherwise. It is a real treat, I promise. I'm Tamara Keith, I cover the White House.
I'm Susan Davis, I cover politics.
And I'm Domenico Montanaro, Senior Political Editor and Correspondent.
And thank you for listening to the NPR Politics Podcast.
And I really feel senior now.
Well, reality bites, Domenico. Reality bites.
On the StoryCorps podcast, we believe a lot of the most interesting stories are right there in front of us, waiting to be told. So every week, we share a candid, unscripted conversation between two people around the themes of love, loss, family, and friendship. These aren't experts or celebrities, just everyday people like you and me. Listen now to the StoryCorps podcast from NPR.
Think of all the things you can do in 10 minutes or less. Scroll through social media, check your bank balance, make a sandwich, or learn about the surprising economics behind all these things. The Indicator from Planet Money is a quick hit of insight into the economics of business, work, and everyday life. Every weekday in less than 10 minutes. Listen now to the Indicator podcast from NPR.
You ever been there when an uncomfortable question about race comes up, but you don't know how to answer?
that's where Code Switch lives. Each week, we're talking about race and how it intersects with every other aspect of your life, especially when it's uncomfortable. Listen now to the Code Switch podcast from NPR.
You two are bad friends.
Who are these two idiots?
White dude and an Asian dude. You two are disgusting.
Oh, you two or something.
We're bad friends.
Santa Claus,
We're little Filipino elves.
No.
Santa Claus,
I heard, dude, this is crazy, dude. I was in Hawaii once, dude.
Yeah.
Aloha.
Aloha.
I was at an ABC store, Aloha.
Aloha.
And I heard Frosty the Snowman over the speakers, Aloha.
Wow.
Frosty hates Hawaii. Don't play that song.
Why would he hate Hawaii?
Because it's his enemy. The environment is the worst environment, Hawaii, for a snowman.
No, dude, he's made of Teflon.
He's not made of snow?
No.
He's Teflon Man?
Teflon Man.
I think he's made of snow. I'm sorry to...
Thank you so much, Dav.
He's made of snow.
Really?
Frosty the...
Even today?
I think so.
Yeah, I think so.
Even like post-Trump? You think he's still made of snow?
Yeah, dude, still. Yeah, he can't just change who he is.
That's right. You can't just change who you are.
Born exactly who you are.
Well, it's like people saying, I'm made out of rock now. I'm not. I'm human.
Right, like for someone that's homophobic or racist, they can never change. They're gonna be that way
I'm
forever.
that too.
3 days of negotiation and still no agreement for a ceasefire in Gaza.
Diplomats continue to search for a resolution that the U.S. won't veto. There could be a vote today as the death toll in Gaza tops 20,000.
I'm Layla Falden with A. Martinez, and this is Up First from NPR News. Talk of civil war is cropping up in some places online after Colorado's high court blocked Donald Trump from the state's ballot. Watchdogs say they're worried violent rhetoric is being normalized.
We're seeing the mainstreaming of this extremism and this encouragement of violence in right-wing media.
And leaders in Chicago say they're struggling with a migrant crisis. Almost 14,000 are housed there in temporary shelters. We'll hear from a Venezuelan woman who says conditions are deplorable. Stay with us. We've got all the news you need to start your day.
Discover a social media empire on a mission to reconstruct America using guns and Facebook. Welcome to No Compromise, podcast winner of the 2021 Pulitzer Prize for audio reporting. Go behind the hot button issues in the national debate and listen to the No Compromise podcast from NPR.
Hi, it's Jasmine Garst from NPR's The Last Cop. I'm one of thousands of NPR network voices coming to you from over 200 local newsrooms across the country. We bring all Americans closer together through free and independent journalism, music, politics, culture, and so much more. The NPR network. What you hear changes everything.
Hey, it's Marielle Segarra from NPR's Life Kit podcast. I'm one of thousands of NPR network voices coming to you from over 200 local newsrooms across the country. We bring all Americans closer together through free and independent journalism on music, politics, culture, and so much more. The NPR network. What you hear changes everything. Learn more at npr.org/network.
The death toll in Gaza has topped 20,000, according to the health ministry there. There had been proposals at the UN Security Council to call for a ceasefire and to let the UN inspect aid trucks to speed up food and fuel destined for Gaza.
But under the threat of a possible U.S. veto, the council has been deadlocked for 3 days, and those ideas seem to be losing steam. Yet, there could be a vote on something today.
NPR diplomatic correspondent Michelle Kellerman has been following all this. Michelle, 3 days of negotiation. What's making it so difficult for the council to get a vote?
So the United Arab Emirates, which is on the Security Council, has been working with other Arab states to push for a humanitarian ceasefire, and they want to speed up aid. And the first draft resolution they put out called for the United Nations to inspect the trucks going into Gaza rather than Israel, which has Gaza under blockade. You know, right now Israel inspects all the trucks to make sure there are no weapons being smuggled in for Hamas. And the U.S. has been working really hard to get Israel to speed that up. The Biden administration really didn't want a UN resolution to further complicate an already complicated situation, but they also didn't want to be in a position of vetoing yet another Security Council resolution as UN officials warn of famine and as health officials in Gaza report that the death toll has topped 20,000.
What might they be able to pass the Security Council?
So last night, the United States ambassador to the UN, Linda Thomas Greenfield, told reporters that there is a new text, and she seemed to be satisfied with the changes in it. Take a listen.
We have worked hard and diligently over the course of the past week with the Emiratis, with others, with Egypt, to come up with a resolution that we can support. And we do have that resolution now. We're ready to vote on it.
She didn't say how the U.S. would vote, whether it would support it, say yes, or abstain, but the goal of all these changes, is to make sure that the U.S. is not going to veto the resolution as it has done with others and not look as isolated.
So for that to happen, how much of that draft resolution had to be watered down?
Well, it doesn't call for a new inspection regime. Instead, it asks the UN Secretary General to appoint an aid coordinator for Gaza. It calls for urgent steps to allow safe and unhindered humanitarian access, but it drops a call for an urgent cessation of hostilities. It simply calls for creating the conditions for a sustainable cessation of hostilities. Thomas Greenfield says that the draft remains, in her words, very strong. She said it gives Arab countries what they think they need to get more aid into Gaza.
The UN and Israel have really been going at each other over Gaza.